All right. Greetings, fellow scientists. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wisconsin Science Festival online field trip, Finding Buried Treasure. Thank you for joining us today. We're ready to get started. My name is Val Blair from the Wisconsin Science Festival team, and we're here with our special guests, Dr. Dave Lovelace and Aaron Kuffner from the UW-Madison Geology. And we have a great field trip experience lined up for you. So how can you participate today? You'll notice that your picture and your audio are muted, but if you have questions you'd like to add, just use the Q&A feature and we'll get those questions read and answered as quickly as we can. The field trip will be recorded, and as always, we ask that you do this and all activities with the Wisconsin Science Festival with a responsible adult. We'd like to thank our sponsors and our partners that make the Science Festival possible, and you can find out more about the activities during the festival at wisconsinsciencefest.org. All right, with that, we're excited to get started. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Val. Hi, everyone. So my name is Dave Lovelace. I am a research scientist at the University of Wisconsin Geology Museum. I am a vertebrate paleontologist. So my job really is studying bones of animals that range in time from the Pleistocene, a few tens of thousands of years ago, all the way into deep time, where I study bones of animals from the Mesozoic mostly, and so around the 250 to 100 to million years ago. And so the things that I do in the museum, I go to the field, we collect fossils, we bring them back to the lab, prepare them, clean them up, study them. But all that started whenever I was a kid in Wyoming. And growing up in Wyoming, we would go out and play in the rocks all the time. I absolutely loved hiking and collecting random bone fragments and rocks. And I think that kind of developed or grew my passion for just being outside and trying to solve problems and just being curious. So that kind of drove me into paleontology and geology ultimately. And that kind of led me to Wisconsin, where I finished my doctorate, and I've been here since. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Kuffner. I am a PhD student, so I work with Dave on some of the older stuff that he works on. So I look at fossil amphibians, and I study those and like how they evolved and all of this fun stuff. I guess the way I got interested in paleontology, it probably goes back to my grandparents. So when they were retired, they went around the country and just collected rocks. They're called rock hounds. So they just love to collect rocks. They happen to collect fossils sometimes. And I would gravitate toward this drawer that was just full of fossils in their basement. I would just look at them for like hours and be like, this is so cool. So that made it like really tangible for me as a kid. And I grew up loving that stuff, and it just one day it just kind of clicked. I should do this for a career. That'd be really cool. And here I am. So with that, I guess we'll take any and all questions that anyone has. I don't know if there's anything else we want to do before that.
Awesome. Thank you for letting us know a little bit about how you've got into the field. We don't have any questions yet, but I'll encourage the teachers and the students to drop those into the Q&A. But maybe you can tell us about the most interesting thing that you found.
Yeah, we found a lot of interesting things over the years, which is always fun to try to navigate towards what are the our favorites, or at least for me, I have a difficult time. I think one of my favorites is this little dinosaur that we found, and it was an accidental discovery. So we were excavating a giant sauropod, Supersaurus, and one vertebra, one backbone, if you hold it up, is from the ground, is probably as tall as most of the students on this call. It is a very, very huge animal. And we have to remove a whole lot of dirt just to get access to the bones to excavate them and dig them out. So doing that, we are using picks and shovels and just plowing through huge volumes of rock. And one of the shovels went through, and we saw a tiny little cross section of something that would have been about half the size of the diameter of a pencil. and it was a hollow bone, and we're like really excited. And so we ended up digging that thing out. We thought it was a pterosaur when we found it, but we were wrong. But it was a dinosaur, and it ultimately became a new species called Hesperornithoides. And it's from the late Jurassic in Wyoming. And that was a pretty fun and pretty special discovery, mainly because it was completely accidental, which it never would have been found if it weren't for the fact that we were digging out this giant sauropod.
I guess mine actually happened really recently, just this last summer. So over the past several years, 1 year hadn't gone because of the pandemic, but we went out to this place in sort of east central Wyoming where we're just looking for fossils. We knew there was bone weathering out, so we're like finding these little fragments of bone just on the surface. We weren't quite sure where it was coming from. Like people looked at this a lot, and we're like, well, I don't know where it's coming from. So we decided to just like survey. So we just marked where every single little piece of bone was, and wherever it was most dense, we're like, well, this might be where it's from. So we did that for a couple of years. Bone was still weathering out. So we're like, okay, there's still something in the ground. There has to be, or maybe it's just like a big pile of dirt with bone fragments in it. But this summer we went back out there, and the first day out, we just put little flags in the ground, and we're like, okay, looks like there's a lot of stuff right there. I'll go dig right there. I dug in and I found stuff I found bones right in place, and that ended up being a quarry that has produced lots and lots of really interesting things that I don't know if I'm at liberty to talk about just yet, but in the few years, like we'll hopefully have some of that out. It's really, really exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. We do have a number of questions now that we can start to answer. So an 8th grade class in DeForest is wondering, have you been on a dig where you've located fossils that are now in the Geology Museum on UW-Madison campus?
Yes, we don't have a whole lot of them that are on display yet. But we are working on that. A lot of the fossils that we work on are from the late Triassic, and so they're around 230 million years old, and that's what Aaron was speaking about, is one of the sites that we work. It takes a long time to prepare the fossils, so even though we've brought material back, the stuff that we've been cleaning up and studying isn't quite ready for display, but we do have them on display in our viewing window in the lab. So if you're walking by the lab, you'll see us actively working on and preparing these fossils and getting them ready, not only in the process of being studied, but they're also going to eventually be mounted, or many of them mounted in the museum, or displayed so that we can see them. But that's a process that's probably a number of years out, well, maybe 1 to 2 years out before we get some kind of larger displays of our Triassic material, but we're really excited to be able to showcase that. It's a lot of work and fun stuff to talk about for sure. Now, that's me personally, what I found. I will put the caveat. We have a dinosaur that is mounted in the museum that was collected by students, prepared by students, and mounted by students. And that's kind of a special thing that students at the UW-Madison get to do. They're active in the program. They collect the material, they prepare it, they study it, kind of the whole enchilada there. So one of the neat things about that is that UW-Madison's Geology Museum was in a race with the Milwaukee Public Museum to see who could mount the dinosaur first and fastest. And so there was this little competition going on, and I think that the folks at the museum in Milwaukee underestimated the enthusiasm that students bring to projects like that. And those employees are working much like I do during business hours, but students, they can go all hours. So they spend a lot of time mounting that dinosaur. So when you come in and see that, it is a pretty special thing, because it is actually something that the museum collected and built and displayed, all with undergraduates leading the charge.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Both Maddox and a class in Portage are wondering some things about where do you work and how long have you been a scientist? And you mentioned the museum, and so they're wondering if there's any fossils that you have around you that you could show us. So
Aaron's better situated for that. I will show one thing because I happen to have a little replica and it kind of shows up okay. This is one of the animals that we're studying, and you can see kind of the white here. That's the skull. That hole right there, that's his eyeball. And then if we look down the mouth of it, there he is. You can kind of see both of his eyeballs on the side, the orbit, the eye hole. This is a little animal that we're currently describing. It is also from the Triassic. It's a little amphibian that burrows down into the ground, and we found them all huddled up in these little burrows. And the white bones back here, those are some of the ribs and some of the other bones in the chest area. And so this little guy, one of the cool things, and I'll take a slight tangent and answer a whole bunch of questions really quick. So I work at the Geology Museum. I have worked at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center and the Geology Museum at Casper College, as well as the Geology Museum as an undergraduate at the University of Wyoming. But I've spent the rest of my career here in Madison, and so this is where I spend most of my time. This little critter, we're actually working with two tribal nations out west, and we worked with 7th graders and tribal elders from the Eastern Shoshone tribe, and we went to the field with them. And in combination, it was an effort that the students went out, we talked about the science, and they actually came up with the name for this little animal right here, along with the elders. And so it was a really awesome experience where we got to highlight some of their history and culture with our students, and in exchange we also learned some Shoshone.
What were the questions? It was where do we work, and do we have fossils around to show us?
Yeah, and how long have you worked there?
Oh yeah. So I started working here in this prep lab while I was still an undergrad. And I spent 2 years after undergrad trying to figure out what to do. Then I ended up going to grad school here. But I started here almost 7 years ago, which is kind of scary to think about. So yeah, I'm just at the UW Geology Museum, but I'm more of a student at UW Madison, working in the geoscience department, and I teach is most of my work. I teach like anatomy, I teach physiology, I teach about evolution and extinction, that kind of stuff. It's really fun. And I have a fossil with me. This one's an actual fossil, not a replica. Let's see if I can get this show up without me dropping it. So this is Wally. Wally is a type of another amphibian, quite a bit larger than the one that Dave just showed. But Wally is an amphibian called Buettner Erpeton bakeri. As of yesterday, when our paper came out, we went back and looked at the original material of Buettner Erpeton bakeri, which is, I realize, a mouthful. That's from Texas, and this one is referable to that species. It's from the same species. That's the important part. And it's one of the earliest of this type of amphibian in North America. It is the earliest in North America, this species. So it's kind of cool. Yeah, there's a lot of work to get this stuff done, but once it's done, it's really exciting. There's not anything particularly, well, there's one other thing I could show. This might not look like much. This is the top of a long-necked dinosaur's head. So you see that one behind me, right up there. So this is the bone that's right. Oh gosh, it's right there.
Nice.
Right in the back of the head. This is the brain case. So the brain would go inside this hole. Yeah.
You have the 3D print next to you too.
Oh, I do, don't I? Oh yeah, there it is. So here's another species.
I was thinking the whole
probably.
skull.
Oh yeah, you're right. It's a mini skull.
Yeah.
Not life size, but here's a skull. So the eye is right here, and this is the nose is technically right up here. It's kind of like a whale in that way. There's those little teeth. Here, maybe I'll put it like that.
There you go.
Yeah. But that bone is from right back here. So that's the brain case. So, yeah, that's kind of cool. They have very small heads relative to the rest of their bodies. Still large heads though.
That's really interesting. There is a follow-up question to what was the type of dinosaur that was found and mounted by the students at UW-Madison?
So that was an Edmontosaurus. It's a late Cretaceous dinosaur that would have been alive around the same time as the Triceratops and Tyrannosaurs. So it's a pretty cool critter there, but it's one of the duck-billed dinosaurs. And then I saw another question related, what dinosaurs have been found in Wisconsin and any amphibians in Wisconsin? And this was from 4th and 5th graders in Portage. And I just wanted to say, unfortunately, there are no dinosaurs that have been found in Wisconsin, in part because the rocks that preserve the dinosaurs, the right aged rocks, don't really exist in Wisconsin, with rare exception. And the one exception is along the very western margin, right along the Minnesota-Wisconsin border. There's a little sliver of Cretaceous rock. Most of it's marine rock and shore sands. We haven't found anything out there, and they're not really well exposed. But one day I hope to find the first dinosaur in Wisconsin, or maybe you all will be looking out there and you can find the first dinosaur from the state. That would be really cool.
Well, kind of related, Greg asks are there any locations in Wisconsin that are good for looking in your field for like artifacts or fossils or things like that?
Mm-hmm. There are a number of great fossil localities. We also have our state is well known, especially in the southern stretches of the state, for Pleistocene aged fossils. So there are a lot of mammoth, mastodon, some other Pleistocene animals, giant beaver, that are really cool from the state. In terms of other fossils, we have some very famous localities. There's one in the Silurian, so 460 something million years ago, 480, I can't remember exactly, long time ago. And that is over in towards Milwaukee and Waukesha area, and it's actually called the Waukesha. It's a Waukesha quarry, and it is a Lagerstätten, which means that it preserves really fine detail, including soft-bodied parts. So these are animals like trilobites and worms. They have little annelids. They have all sorts of crazy cool soft-bodied organisms that are preserved. And that is extraordinarily rare and very, very special. It's a world-class fossil locality. Otherwise, throughout the southern parts of the state and all the way up the Michigan coastline, we find fossils from throughout the throughout the Cambrian and kind of the early history of life. So lots of seashells and corals and cephalopods and things like that. So Wisconsin has a lot of those kinds of fossils, but not many of the younger ones like dinosaurs or that age.
If you're driving southwest on the highways, in like the driftless area, you'll drive through like road cuts through the Platteville limestone, and there are fossils that occur in there. So you could literally get out of your car on the highway safely, of course, and you could potentially find fossils right there on the highway.
Road cuts are great.
That's cool. Thank you. There's a couple of questions here from Portage asking what kind of tools are used in the field and what is that machine behind Aaron?
Aha. Well, tools in the field. I'll let you talk about tools in the lab, Aaron. The tools in the field, I'll tell you what, we've gone high tech in the field. We use rock hammers and chisels, just like they did in the 1800s. Well, okay, 1900s. Well, I guess 1800s. So yeah, it's all really simple tools for removing rock for the most part. The one thing that has changed for us is the types of adhesives and glues and consolidants that we use. So we use things that are actually plastics now. They're plastic that is dissolved in some sort of solvent like acetone. And then when you put it on the specimen, the acetone evaporates and then the plastic reforms. And that is the kind of glue that we use, whereas they used organic glues like melted down horse hooves and various other organics that they made glues from in the late 1800s. So that has changed, but otherwise we literally use the same tools: picks, shovels, hammers, chisels, and all the way down to brushes and dental picks. But that's most of what we use in the field, and it hasn't changed. Even the plaster jackets, the things that we encase the fossils in to bring them back, it's basically the same exact stuff that was being used in the late 1800s. So that part of the technology hasn't changed that much, but they were using those same tools in the lab when they were preparing all of these very famous early dinosaurs and early fossils. Whereas nowadays we have some pretty special tools. Segue.
Yeah. So we'll start off with the machine behind me. I'm guessing you mean this big blue hose right here. So that connects to a thing that's all the way over in the corner, that blue thing right back there, over there ish. Okay, I can't do it with the hands. But that's a dust collector. It's like a big suction device that pulls all the dust out of the air, so we aren't inhaling that into our lungs, because you don't really want a lot of dust in your lungs. Like, this is little bits of rock, like that does some damage. Another thing that we use, these guys. So this is called an air scribe. So this works by having compressed air in this hose go through this tool, and it oscillates this needle back and forth, and it acts like a little tiny jackhammer, and you just very gently just move it along, and it'll pop little bits of rock off, and ideally you don't touch the fossil with it at all. So this one should be plugged in, so it should turn on. Oh yeah, there we go. And I am currently sitting in a working lab, so if anyone were to come in and start working, you'd hear a lot of this in the background.
Yeah, our lab is always buzzing with activity.
That's great. Two questions from one from Greg and one from Portage that were similar. How many years of school did you need to go to before you could start going out finding fossils? And then, like, what did you study? What was your major?
Cool. So it's great, actually. Aaron and I have slightly different trajectories on how we got here. So I started off, I mean, I came through a slightly circuitous path to get here, but the bottom line is I took geology. And so I focused a lot on the geological side. I ended up spending 4 years as an undergrad to get my geology degree, but I also minored. Well, I also took classes and did work in biology and zoology as well, because I really was interested in the animals, but I was quite interested in the rocks and what the stories that the rocks can tell us, basically to build a context for the fossils we were finding. My master's took me another 2.5 years, and that was in geobiochemistry. I was actually looking at little tiny microbes and proteins on their outer surface and how it interacts with rock. Really crazy stuff. And then I came to Madison in 2008 and started my dissertation work, my PhD work. And then my dissertation focused on a kind of a combination of paleontology and geology, but I really was focusing on the rocks again. And so my geology degree, my PhD is in geology. And I'm effectively on paper, I'm a sedimentologist. So I work on sedimentary rocks and try to interpret them. But in reality, I'm a vertebrate paleontologist. And so I end up doing more working with fossils, even though that's not necessarily all of my formal training.
Yeah, how did I get here? My undergrad was in evolutionary biology, so I was really curious about like how evolution works, like all the mechanics of it. And I studied a lot of like genetics and molecular evolution at the time. I even am still involved with a lab here on campus doing some molecular evolution work, because I just find it really, really interesting. But then I had always had this idea of like, I really like paleontology because you can look at like macro evolutionary patterns. You can look like big speciation events and like how things change through time. Like, that's really cool. So I ended up kind of volunteering here during my last year of undergrad, and then stuck around for a couple of years while I was just, working on prepping fossils that I'm now using for my dissertation. And then I did a little bit of a circuitous route because I did like a master's in the middle of a PhD. It was a lot of stress during the pandemic, I'll say. But then I'm stuck around for the PhD to kind of round out the stuff I've been working on. Yeah.
Awesome. There are a lot of questions about what is the largest fossil that you've ever found or the smallest fossil.
Awesome. I'll start because yeah. So the largest specimen that I ever worked on, remember that dinosaur I talked about at the very beginning, Hesperornithoides? Well, that was the accidental find, right? The biggest one that I was working on was the giant sauropod underneath it. And that sauropod was the size, it is the longest land animal ever. So it is one of the biggest dinosaurs in the world. It wasn't the heaviest, but it was the longest. It was a pretty special thing. Small fossils, all sorts of crazy cool small fossils. The small ones, like these little amphibians, I really like. They're great. But one of my favorite ones are these little things called charophytes, and they're tiny little microscopic parts of algae, but they're algae that grow in very specific environments. And so finding those tells you something very important about the water pH and the temperatures of the water and how fast it was moving. And so I like those fossils just because they tell a cool story, and they were tiny.
I actually don't know what the largest fossil I found is, but I can think of one very, very tiny fossil I found, and that was actually in this amphibian bone bed. So it was like alongside these guys, but it was not an amphibian. It was like a little teeny tiny bone of a fish. And we have very few bones of these fish, at least from this place in Wyoming where we've been going. So it was just like a little teeny tiny bone, and it looked like it had little teeth on it. I think it might be like this front bone right in our jaws or upper jaws. Although gotta verify that one. But it was very cool because I just saw, oh my gosh, those are teeth. And it's just very teeny tiny. It was like maybe a millimeter or two across.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. There are a couple questions about for Mrs. Brandel's class. Have you ever found any primate fossils or early human fossils?
Nope. That's a short answer. Unfortunately not. That would be so cool, especially the primates. In Wyoming, in the area that we work on the other we work on the edge of the basin and on the middle of the basin. There are actually the earliest primates, they're called plesiadapids, are from those rocks. And so they've been found nearby where we work, but we don't study that age rock. So I have not found one yet. I've always had that as a bucket list dream of finding a little plesiadapid. I think that would be so cool. They look like eyes, if you've ever seen eyes. Pictures of
I'd
those.
say more like a bush baby, but
oh, okay. Bush baby is better because it also is one that's probably is better known than an eye. Yeah. They're really kind of not silly. They're cool looking. But no, I have not found or worked on any actual hominin specimens outside of ones that have already been collected.
All right. There's also a question about like, how do you get the bones out of the rock? And are you ever successful at finding all of them, like all of the bones in a single specimen?
Haha. That's a great question.
Yeah.
The short answer is, well, Aaron's kind of described a little bit using that little jackhammer type tool. And that's how we get, I mean, when we have the specimens come in, they're pretty much covered in rock. And so we use that to chip off the rock and expose the fossil. Now, I happen to be working on a fossil in the back of the lab that is a partial skeleton. And unfortunately, it doesn't have everything there. And it's very, very rare to actually get something that's articulated, which it means the bones are in order as they were in life, as if the animal just died and all the skin and gooey bits went away and you have a skeleton. That would be articulated. Usually something happens to that skeleton. Another animal kicks it accidentally or moves it around. Something might scavenge on it and like literally eat the bone parts of the skeleton. Wind might blow it around, or water moves it around, and most of these things have to be buried by rock that's being brought in by water. So that often happens, that you'll actually get the skeletons will get all jumbled up. So the odds of finding a complete one are very, very rare. It happens, but it's not common. And even when it does happen, usually there's something missing, because in order to find it, it had to erode out of the surface at some level, unless you found another specimen that might be incomplete and you discover a complete skeleton while you are excavating the other one. That happens often enough. In fact, one of the quarries that Aaron has spent a lot of time on is similar to that, in the sense that we found fragments on the surface, we dug it in, and that's when we started finding nicer material, but nothing complete yet.
There is a specimen in the museum that is an almost complete skeleton of a mosasaur. And that one has a really cool story, because they found what they initially found was fragments of the tail that were weathering out, and they just fall. A mosasaur is like it's a big sea lizard. So they found the tail, and it's a fairly long tail. So they followed that in, and they found an entire skeleton missing that end of the tail, and of all things, its skull was just gone. But they found the rest of it. They found the rest of this entire animal, which is really, really cool. You can make up scenarios and stories about how that skull disappeared. I like to think another mosasaur got it, but we have no idea.
It's really interesting. Isla is wondering what the most popular place is to hunt for fossils.
So this is one of the great questions that always has another question that I have to ask in return. So where the great places to find fossils, it all depends on what you're looking for, what kind of fossils. So for instance, hominin fossils, are the human ancestors, the fossils and the animals that led up to humans are not found in North America. So we wouldn't be looking here for them. That's the first step. We have to know where they might be found globally, and then find the right areas that have it. And then those areas, they have to have the right age rock, and that rock has to be exposed at the surface, like not covered in jungle or not underwater. And it has to be accessible in the sense of ownership. We have to know who can give us permission to actually go look and collect on that land. So when I go look, I'm looking for Triassic age fossils. So I look on geology maps and find where Triassic rock is exposed at the surface. Then I use Google Earth and I look and find what's exposed at the surface and is accessible, as in I can actually see the rocks. It's not covered in dirt or forests. And then I look at ownership maps and figure out who owns the land and get permission to go on it. So there's a number of steps that go into it, but the very first thing is what kind of fossil you want to find. So it's a bit of a complex answer, but for us, looking for Mesozoic fossils in the mostly in the United States, we find them along the Rocky Mountains. They're exposed on both sides of the Rocky Mountains, but also along the coastlines down by Alabama, through Georgia, and up the East Coast as well. I have a lot of really great Mesozoic rocks.
I got nothing to
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure if like maybe you can, I'm not sure if the answer to this question, but I'm not the expert, but can you tell from the fossils if and how many of the dinosaurs would have had feathers?
Yeah, I just saw this question down there. That's a great one. It turns out, so we've modeled this question in what's called an ecological model. We actually tried to build the physiology, like how warm was the animal, how much did it move around, how much food would it eat, how fast did it metabolize, and all these questions that get put into this little computer model and help us interact that animal with the environment. Now, why this was fun and important is we were looking at early dinosaurs specifically and wondering, well, did they have feathers? We know that meat-eating dinosaurs had feathers more derived well up the tree. Like velociraptors and oviraptors had feathers for sure, but how far down the tree did the feathers go? Well, we don't have body fossils from Triassic things that have feathers in terms of theropod dinosaurs, but we do know that they all share a common ancestor. So if we go down the theropod line and down the ornithischian, things like hadrosaurs and duck-billed dinosaurs and stegosaurs, and then the sauropods, they all kind of come down to the base of the tree, the base of the family tree of dinosaurs, and they're are feathers on all of the branches, with the exception of sauropods, but they're giant and weird, so we don't know exactly how they fit. But primitively, they almost certainly had feathers, kind of, and the early evolution of earliest sauropods almost certainly had feathers. That doesn't mean that all dinosaurs were feathered. What that means is that the ancestors of dinosaurs, the earliest dinosaurs, almost all had feathers, but as they diverged into their multiple groups and all sorts of cool dinosaurs, they may have lost those feathers. Or they just kept them in various parts of their body. We don't know, but we know that we have the skin impressions of some that don't have feathers and some that do, for sure. But primitively, all dinosaurs almost certainly would have had feathers, because we also find feather-like structures on the group even just outside of dinosaurs, things like pterosaurs, which aren't dinosaurs, but are closely related.
Flying reptiles.
Yeah.
I think it's also worth noting that like mammals all have hair. Our ancestors all have hair, right? But a lot of modern mammals, like some of them lose most of that hair, like hippos lose most of the hair. Elephants, while they might have like a lot of hair, you still see the vast majority of their skin. Whales lose the vast majority of their hair on their bodies. So like it's not even like a stretch to say, oh, these things might not have been feathered, but their ancestors were definitely feathered, right?
Thank you for that. You mentioned Wyoming, and we talked a little bit about Wisconsin, but there's two questions here from Calvin and from Scora. I think that's a class name. But how much traveling do you get to do for your job, and do you get to leave the country to search for fossils?
Yes, we do get to travel all over the world to look for fossils. I don't personally, I mean, in part because my research is really focused on one particular area, but I've done a little bit of field work in, very briefly visiting other colleagues in countries. So I've done some field work in Portugal, in Italy, and a little bit in Brazil. But none of that was my research. It was just basically a field trip for me. I got to go out and look at cool things that some of my colleagues have found or done. But there are fossils all over the world, and researchers travel all over to find them, including Antarctica, where there's some amazing dinosaurs from there. I'm dinosaur centric. It's kind of what I work on.
And amazing amphibians.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, there's fossils all over. We just don't happen to go around in our research lab.
Another thing that I've done a lot of is traveling around to other museums, because they have collections that have, they've acquired things from all over the place, and they've kind of coalesced all of this stuff into one location. So if I want to go study like this one type of amphibian, I can look up, who's got what, so I can figure out where I should travel to study that stuff.
Awesome. This is kind of a follow-up question to what you were just talking about, but how do you know where to start digging for fossils? Is it kind of random, or are there signs, or it's a good place to dig? I know you were talking about like the flags you placed, Aaron, and you were really lucky that day. What kind of leads you to find the spot?
I can go in a bit more depth with that one. So those flags we were placing, like we're marking out every single bone. Some of those were really weathered. They're like really worn down and rounded, and it looks like they'd been out on the surface for a lot longer. But the reason I really went for this denser area of material is not just because it was a dense area of bones, but because the bones had like nice sharp breaks. So that told me they hadn't been exposed for very long, right? So I was like, well, it has to be at least near here. So that's really what did it for me, was just looking for sharp breaks in bones, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it was really helpful. I don't know if you have anything to add, Dave.
No, I think that's good.
Cool.
Cool. This goes back to a couple minutes ago when we were way early when you were talking about the new name that you just published in that paper. How do you name do you get to name the dinosaurs that you find?
That's a good question. Yes. If we find a dinosaur, or we find any fossil, and we study it, and once we clean it up and we start seeing the morphology, all the little bumps and grooves, and awesome little features, we compare that to other animals that exist and are known. And when we find novel features, things that tell us that this is a new animal, yeah, we get to name it. And one of the things that we're working on right now and that our lab has been focusing on, Aaron and a number of other students and myself have been working, like, as I mentioned earlier, with tribal members of the Wind River Reservation, coming up with names. So we have 3 new taxa. That means 3 new animals that we've given scientific names. 2 of them are in the Shoshone language, and 1 is in the northern, or in Arapaho, in the northern Arapaho language. And the cool part about that is we're starting to kind of branch out from the way that science has been done for a really long time. The names of fossils have all been given in Latin, but there's a big history that kind of rolls into that, and it's not really representative of where the fossils come from, the cultures that they're come from or associated with, and we're trying to acknowledge that, and hopefully as a science group move forward and beyond kind of our historical ways of naming things. But yeah, we get to name them, and it is a fun process, but it also can be a little anxiety inducing. Am I making it? Am I doing it right? Yeah, no, but it's a lot of fun. I don't get to name them after myself, so
Don't ever name anything after yourself.
Yeah. You aren't supposed to. It's illegal.
No.
Aaron just got to name a new animal.
I did, yeah. We what we did is we just compared it with all the other known very similar looking animals, and we're like, okay, this species was named a long time ago, but it's been bouncing around in between different genera. So when I say like a genus is like, we're the species Homo sapiens, but our genus is Homo, right? So there's lots of different species under Homo sapiens. So this one was bouncing around in between, like no one could really come up with a consensus on like what should be the genus name for this thing. So we decided to look at it in more detail and actually like write it all up all over again. The last time it was done was in the 1930s, right? So it needed a little bit of an update. And we recognize that it is distinct from other known species and genera of this group of animals. So we gave it a new name, and we decided to resurrect an old name, because originally this species was named to honor this guy named William Butner, who did a lot of work at the University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology. So we talked with the collections manager at University of Michigan. He's like, it'd be really cool if we could do that. So we're like, okay, it doesn't really bother us. Like, we didn't have any particular reason for naming it anything. We just decided to call it Butner Erpeton. Erpeton is just like a word used to refer to like herpetology, like creepy reptile-y amphibian things. It's used a lot. But that was just, we just decided to go with that. Yeah.
Cool.
Fantastic. So we only have 2 minutes left, and it's unlikely that we'll get to all of the questions that have answered, but thank you so much for participating and asking all of those great questions. I wanted to give both Dave and Aaron just a moment to share any last things that you wanted to share with the students.
All right. Let's see. Sorry, I'm like typing, trying to get some of these questions answered. I would like to say that, when I was a kid and when growing up, I basically got out and just played around outside. And I think that was really fun for me and developmental for me as a scientist, but all of us are scientists. You are all out there engaging in the world around you and making observations all the time. And I just want you to kind of recognize that you are observing the world and you are putting things together in novel ways, and the things that you're putting together is going to change in the future how we see the world. And so it's a pretty cool thing. And be proud of yourselves and keep getting out, making observations, and enjoy.
Gonna set it better. Look for like things that like connect between things. Like how does like math tell me more about this thing? Like math can be useful, but just like that connectedness of everything is really what I think has made me like really interested and a better scientist.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today at the Wisconsin Science Festival on this virtual field trip. Thanks to our field trip presenters, Dave and Aaron. And a recording of this field trip will likely be available, and I'll send that out to the teachers. And remember, the Wisconsin Science Festival continues with events hosted from organizations across the state, and you can participate in over the next few days. Just check out wisconsinsciencefest.org. So thank you again, Aaron and Dave. This was a great session, and thank you for all those amazing questions, students. All right, have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.